Hi, and welcome to Birth and Baby Talk. This week, we are talking about how often do you breastfeed a baby? And if you don't know, I'm Leanne Palmerston. I'm from Hamilton Family Doulas, and I'm one of your regular hosts here on Birth and Baby Talk. So, you're planning to breastfeed. Great. And how often do you do that? Babies, right? Do they eat similar to us? Like, do they eat like every 4-ish hours? Do they have like 3 squares and a couple of snacks? Well, no, they eat very differently to us, and for a couple of different reasons. First of all, when they're first born, their stomachs are really, really small. So those stomachs fill up really quickly and empty really quickly, which means they need to eat more frequently. And if we go back just a step to when they were still in the womb, babies were eating, not with their mouths or anything, but they were being, it was almost like they were being fed IV food, but through their umbilical cord. And that food was on a continual basis. So the blood that flowed through the umbilical cord and the placenta and then went into the baby's body got cycled back through the placenta and into the umbilical cord, and then got refreshed from the maternal blood supply. I've got this backwards. So from the baby through the cord to the placenta. At the placenta, the blood supply from the baby sort of gets rid of its toxins, byproducts, the kinds of things that our livers and kidneys do for us very well. So all of that stuff gets kind of dumped into the maternal blood supply, where we, as gestating parents, would then flush it through our kidneys and livers, getting rid of the sort of normal broken down stuff from our bodies and cells to get rid of. But then the baby is also drawing on nutrition from that maternal blood supply on a constant basis. Like with every single heartbeat, there is nutrition being pulled and then flooded through the baby and being used as needed. So when a baby is born, that system stops, like bang, on a dime. We literally cut the connection between the gestating body and the baby body when we cut that cord. So suddenly the baby is not getting their regular nutrition. Suddenly they have to ask for it, which they don't know how to really do at first. Babies, all they really know is that when they're sucking, it could be on their own finger, or it could be on the back of a hand, it could be on an arm. It doesn't matter. They know when they're sucking on something, they're happy. So when they come out, if we give them a pacifier, they will happily suck on it, especially in those first few days, right? If you never give a baby a pacifier, by the way, and you try to do it like when they're a month old, they probably will reject it. Just a pro tip for you. But as an example, a brand new baby will happily suck on a pacifier. They will happily suck on your finger if you were to put it inside their mouth. But if we're choosing to chest feed a baby, then we need to bring them to the chest, to the breast, and allow them to latch and suck so that they can get their self-soothing, which is what sucking does for a baby. They get all that action at the breast. So when a baby nurses, their first instinct for nursing is for calming themselves, sort of in a mental way, in a physical way. The second thing they're doing is pulling nutrition into their body, but they don't really know that. They're not really aware of it. They just know that when they do that sucking, they're really happy. So how often do we do that? Well, there are a couple of different ways. So some parents will decide to feed a baby on a schedule. They will feed, and if you're going to feed a baby on a schedule, you need to feed a baby every 2 to 3 hours. Well, when we say 2 to 3 hours, that can be really variable, right? Some parents choose to feed a baby every 3 hours, but there are some problems with that, especially for a smaller baby, a baby under a couple of months old. The thing is, their stomach capacity is only so large. So if you're feeding a baby every 3 hours, and 3 into 24 is 8, so you're feeding a baby 8 times, what you're doing is, that is right, isn't it? Did I just get my math wrong? No, that's correct. So you're going to feed a baby 8 times in a day, once every 3 hours. What you're probably going to find is that when you take a look at the total volume of milk a baby needs to drink in one day, the amount that they will take in on a 3-hour basis is probably larger than they're able to drink in one sitting. So we start to run into some problems. So while scheduling feeds probably works better later on, and probably aligns better for a baby who is getting all of their nutrition from a bottle source. So if you're a full-time pumping parent, or you're using formula, then scheduling feeds every 3 hours after that newborn period is over, that makes sense, and that's totally doable. But when we're looking at a brand new baby, a newborn, we're looking at the problem of the small stomach. They also, brand new babies, very small babies, tend to fall asleep very easily when they eat. They get tired out. They forget that they're supposed to eat efficiently. They're not like us. They don't think, okay, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to eat my, like my chili, and I'm going to have this piece of toast, and then I might have a bit of salad as well, and then I'll have dessert. But, I have to be finished my entire meal within about 30 minutes because I have to move on to the next thing. No, babies will eat for 10 minutes and then snooze for 10 minutes, and then eat for 10 minutes and then snooze for 10 minutes, and then eat for 2 minutes and then snooze for 20 minutes, and then eat for 5 minutes. So a little tiny, tiny baby really has a kind of disorganized way to us of eating. But what they're doing is following their physical instincts. They're like, okay, I have a level of satiety, right? When you're eating, you ever eat a pint of ice cream and you're like, I'm going to demolish this Haagen-Dazs. And then you get about a third of the way and you're like, yeah, I think I'm done. But there's all this Haagen-Dazs, so maybe you'll eat a little extra. But at a certain point, you're like, yeah, I'm just going to put the rest in the freezer. I'll have some tomorrow. Because that's a lot of food at one sitting. And so babies are similar. They hit a point where they're like, oh, okay, I don't necessarily need to eat anymore. I'm satisfied. And then they might fall asleep. They're like, I'm satisfied and kind of tired. And then while they snooze, the level of food in their stomach gets processed and starts to go down, as their stomachs empty into their bowels to finish this processing of food. So they wake up after 5 or 10 minutes and they're like, oh, no, I could eat some more. So they want to eat some more. That's what babies, little tiny, tiny babies do. Brand new babies. And we're talking, that's very typical for the first 3, 4, or 5 days, that first week or less of a new baby's life, they will eat like that. So it's really, really important that for a brand new baby, we think about not so much like how many times do I have to feed you and how will that work out on a clock. Like if I have to feed a baby a minimum of 8 times, am I doing that at 2 and then 6 and then 10? No. We're thinking about what is a baby telling me that they need? And so we learn to look at the signals that the baby is giving us to let us know that the baby is hungry. What are some of those signals? Well, they come in different levels of, of amplification. I like that. Like turning on the radio. At first, they're really quiet, right? You can turn the radio on just a little. They turn their dial up to 2, and they might be snoozing and then suddenly start going and kind of licking their lips. They might be squirming around in their sleep and, move their mouth around like they're trying to eat something. Those are some really early signs. And then some bigger signs, maybe they turn the dial up maybe about to 5, and they're like, okay, nobody heard me, so I'm going to get a little louder. So then they start moving their head back and forth. They might, if you're holding them, they might start bobbing their face off of your chest or your shoulder. They might, if you get your hand near their face, if you're like, you're so cute, they might try to eat it. Those are some really, really strong signals. Also, they stick their tongues out. They smack their lips like little fishies. So those are some of those early signals. But if the baby is not fed when they're showing those signals, they'll turn the dial up again. And this time they'll turn it to 10. And 10 sounds like crying. So they might start going, wah, wah, to try to alert you like, hey, I've been trying to tell you I'm hungry and would really like to eat right now. And you didn't hear me. So I just wanted to get a bit louder for you. Now, I want to remind you, when a baby cries, it's an important communication tool for them. When your baby cries, it doesn't mean you failed. It doesn't mean that you haven't been attentive to your baby. It just means that in all of the stuff we have to do in life, your baby's polite request for food didn't get heard the first time. And they're just letting you know. They're reinforcing their message. So don't be freaked out if you put the baby down and 10 minutes later, after you were trying to maybe make yourself something to eat or close your eyes for 5 whole minutes, that the baby starts crying and you have to feed them again. It does not mean that you are not doing it correctly. It means that everything's actually working right. So it's a good sign. And we want you to respond when that baby cries. So when that baby does cry, or if you notice an earlier sign, little tongue darting or a little rooting action as they try to turn their heads and look for what they're sure is a nipple off to the side, scoop them up, go to a comfy spot to nurse, and settle in to nurse your baby. It can often, in the early days, it can often take a long time to kind of get started with breastfeeding, because not only are you learning how to do it, your baby is learning how to do it too. Remember, we talked about how babies don't eat when they're in utero inside the birthing parent. They don't know how to eat food. We have to teach them how to do that by using one of their favorite things to do, which is to do the sucking motion. So as we're teaching baby to eat and they fall asleep very frequently, what we're doing is we're spending an awful lot of time in that nursing position. We're spending a lot of time sort of getting baby latched, realizing the latch might not be ideal, stopping the latch and starting over. And we might do that a few times. And then we're trying to get the milk to flow and get the baby interested. And again, that may take a few minutes. And then the nursing begins. So already we've built in this extra time for nursing. Then the baby falls asleep for a little bit or takes these long pauses. That's also super normal in early breastfeeding behavior, is babies can sometimes do the equivalent of put their fork and knife down and just sit and breathe for a few minutes quietly. It's very, very common. It's common with adults to take breaks while you eat to just sort of allow things to settle and digest before moving on to taking your next mouthful. So babies do it too. Don't get freaked out. And then, this start and stop sort of pattern that babies have means that in the first few days of a baby's life, one feed can sometimes take 30 or 40 minutes. Whereas when we compare that to like a 6-month-old baby, one feed might take 15 to 20 minutes and be much more efficient. So we've got a baby who's taking a long time to eat. And then when they finally are like, oh yeah, they're definitely full, they are not interested in eating, they're taking a really long break, they might sleep for 20 minutes and then wake up and want to eat again, right? This is really, really frequently. So that minimum of 8 times a day starts to look like, in practice, in reality, it starts to look more like 12 to 18 times a day. What we're looking for when the baby is starting to learn how to eat, and then if you don't know, you're going to have this sort of pre-milk available to the baby for the first couple of days called colostrum that will switch over to regular breast milk after about 3 or 4 days. Then after that, it takes a couple more days for your baby to get used to drinking this like higher volume of their regular breast milk. So after the first week or so, what we're looking for is a solid 8 to 12 times per day, no matter what. It can be as few as 8 and be as high as 12, but that's your target zone. And that's going to stay the same probably for most of your baby's first year. Sounds like a lot, doesn't it? But like I said before, the older a baby becomes, the more efficient they get. And you will also notice when you respond to the baby's needs for eating, what you will notice is some of the feeds will be kind of close together and some of the feeds will be a little farther apart. So that's why we don't really recommend a scheduled every 3 hours for a very small baby, because a baby might eat every 2.5 to 2 hours, during most of the day. And then somewhere around 6 o'clock, they might start eating like almost constantly for a couple of hours. And then they might be able to sleep for 3 hours or 4 hours in a chunk at night. So those feeds, we can see they're normally spaced apart during the day. In the evenings, they get closer together. At night, they get a little bit farther apart sometimes for some babies. It's important to remember that all babies have variations of these patterns. So your baby is not necessarily going to do the exact same thing as the baby next door, who is not going to do the exact same thing as the baby down the street. So be very careful about looking to other babies to copy patterns, because each baby is very unique. You want to just get attuned to what you're looking for, recognizing when the baby is hungry, and then offering food to the baby when they're hungry. If you are switch feeding, which means using both bottle and breast, or if you are opting to go to bottle only, regardless of whether it's breast milk or formula, you should be probably following the same general pattern for young babies. So for that newborn period, you should be focusing on responding to that baby's stated needs. The baby will tell you when they're hungry. And there's one caveat to that. If a baby is chronically underfed, and I want to say that in a really gentle way, like I want you to receive that information gently. It just means that you may not realize that the amount of milk that the baby is getting is a lot lower than they ought to be getting. And a baby who is drinking less milk than they should, because either the supply of milk is not like available in high volume, or they're unable to transfer the milk from the parent's body into their body, right? Like, so sometimes it's a supply issue and sometimes it's an issue on the side of the demand, right? The baby is not able to demand it because maybe there's something going on in their mouth, lots of different things going on. It's not super, super common. So I don't want you to assume that just because your baby is sleepy for a couple of days that they're chronically underfed. And I don't want you to become obsessed about the amount of milk going into your baby. If we haven't already addressed this on the show, we can totally do an episode in the next little while about how to know when your baby has gotten enough food. But let's just talk back a little bit about the frequency. So I don't want you to get freaked out about the amount of milk your baby may be getting. Just be aware that if your baby every single day seems to only wake to feed every 3 or 4 hours, then clue into how much weight they're gaining and to check in on that, because sometimes babies who are not able to drink enough milk can be a little extra sleepy. But generally, except in that case, babies tend to wake up when they're hungry. They tend to ask for their food. And if you can attune yourself to those messages, you'll be able to feed your baby on the exact right frequency. Some of those babies will be super, super chubby. And I want to also make a caveat that that's cool. Breastfed babies can be super chubby, and that does not mean they're overfed. A breastfed baby can't really be overfed. They'll just poop all the excess food out of them. Or if somehow they've drank too much in a single feeding, they will spit up the excess because it will not fit in their tummy and it'll push up through their esophagus a little bit. That's probably not a problem that you're going to face, though. You're going to have a baby. When breastfeeding is going well, the baby will take in as much food as they need, expel it through the normal routes out their diaper when they've had too much. And you will find that the frequency probably settles into a really nice pattern, especially when you're able to breastfeed in an exclusive way. I know it can sound, from the outside, having never done it before, it can sound a little scary to think about, oh gosh, like every 2.5-ish hours, my baby is going to want to feed for somewhere in the neighborhood of 20, 30 minutes. That sounds like a huge time commitment. And on one hand, it is, but when breastfeeding is going well, it actually fits into your schedule quite easily. It seems to slip in. It doesn't necessarily seem particularly burdenful. It builds in these beautiful moments of rest and relaxation for both you and your baby, where you can sit down and snuggle. And I know some of you are super duper, you're go-getters. You'd like to be active, and sitting down and nursing your baby might not feel like the most productive use of your time. If you can find a way of really sinking into that settled feeling, it really becomes more of a meditation and a moment for connection and chat with your baby. You can talk to them, and it's lovely. So a newborn baby, when we're talking about frequency, a newborn baby could eat in that first few days, could be eating as frequently as every hour or every hour and a half. By the time the milk starts to come in, the mature milk, not that colostrum milk, but the colostrum is just quite thick, but the milk, which, has the consistency of whole milk, when that comes in around day 3 or 4 or 5, the baby will be eating larger volumes, and then you'll start to notice that the feeds start to space out a little. And as they space out a little, they will get more in that 2 to 3 hour zone, and you will see that your baby will naturally slip into a pattern of 8 to 12 times per day, with the frequency shifting slightly depending on the time of the day. Again, during the daytime portion, they will be fairly evenly distributed. In the evening, they can often be very, very close together, very ultra frequent feeds, which can feel overwhelming and annoying. I promise it's limited to those times. And by the time babies are 2 or 3 months old, they often completely outgrow that evening, call that cluster feeding. And then overnight, the feeds might space out to a little closer to around 3 hours with an occasional larger gap. And then, when they're much older, when they're around 4 months old or so, they will feed in that 2.5 to 3 hour zone, which with overnight feeds being more in the 3 to 4 hour zone. When they're getting closer to around 6 months, they might drop some of their night feeds completely, and you might see the overall frequency of feeding drop to about 8 feeds a day. But those 8 feeds are, or even maybe 6 feeds a day if they're not feeding overnight, but those feeds might be distributed slightly differently through the day and evening. It's just all depending on your baby's habits. And then when you introduce food, again, that can cause a little bit of shifting around in the frequency of feeds. And we might see 1 or 2 feeds get dropped. But I want to caution you, allow the baby to drop feeds, not you. Okay, so like when you're introducing regular bottles into your baby's life, if you do that, then allow the baby to express when they'd like to eat as much as possible. And when you start to introduce regular table food meals, if you're giving your baby a little bit of lunch, a little bit of dinner, a little bit of breakfast or snacks, also remember that those foods are kind of an addition to what they're getting with their breast milk. So they should always be having their primary liquid diet, whether that is breast milk, chest milk, whether that is formula, whether it's pumped milk. They should always have access to those things first. And then the food, like the chicken or the butternut squash or whatever it is that your baby is eating should be in addition to that. And eventually your baby will start to express different preferences for how they want to distribute their feeds. But you'll probably start to see the feeds go down to about 6 to 8 feeds a day for a while, until they start to go more to 4 to 6 feeds later around a year. But again, the baby expresses the frequency. The baby expresses their preference. When the baby asks for milk, asks for a bottle, asks for the chest or the breast, then we can give that to them as they need it. And then we know we're never underfeeding our babies, right? Because again, when we're feeding baby, especially when we're feeding baby on the body, then they're not overeating. They will limit themselves really well. When we're using bottles to feed a baby, if we're listening to their stated need of how often they want to feed, and we're slowing the feed down with our favorite way of feeding babies in a paced manner, if we're slowing the feed down a little bit, then those babies will not be overeating. They will only take in as much food as they need. Okay. I hope that helps you understand more about the frequency of feeding a baby. So, like your TLDR, your too long didn't read, which, comes at the end, seems useless, right? But I'm going to give it to you anyway. Your takeaway here is that even if a book or a handout or a manual says babies need to eat 8 to 12 times a day, look less at the frequency and less at the timing of it, and watch the baby's expression of their personal needs, and give the baby what they ask for. And you will always find that you're feeding the baby the right amounts. Okay, take care.